Hello, and thank you for joining us for this two-part webinar series presented by the Violence-Free Coalition, which is under the umbrella of ARCS, the Abuse and Rape Crisis Shelter of Warren County. My name is Holly Smith, and I work for the Violence-Free Coalition here in Warren County. This first webinar is on risk factors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence as that relates to the teens we know in Warren County schools. In our second part of the webinar series, we'll talk about protective factors. I'm the Community Prevention Coordinator here at the VFC, and I have the unique opportunity to teach students in Warren County about risk and protective factors within their relationships. I go to each Warren County school and present a 5-day curriculum that goes through what some of their relationships should be looking like. So what healthy relationships should look like, unhealthy relationships, and what abusive relationships can look like. Beyond statistics and facts, I have learned so much from our Warren County teens. I hope that this webinar series is informative for you and truly helps you with your relationships with teenagers in your life. These 3 objectives are what I hope you learn within the next hour. We are going to explore what intimate partner violence is and what sexual violence is and how it relates to the teens in Warren County. We're going to explore what risk factors are present for them and teens around the country. And then I'll talk about what next steps you can take in your life. This information is so important in prevention. We are working towards preventing every type of violence, and especially sexual violence or intimate partner violence for teens in Warren County. Sharing this information with you and you taking it into your own life is just another way that we can prevent teen dating violence and intimate partner violence with our teens in Warren County. Now, before we move forward, I'm betting that you're asking, what are all of these acronyms? Or as we move along, you'll wonder what all of these acronyms are. I mentioned ARCS before, but it stands for Abuse and Rape Crisis Shelter, and that's where I work here in Warren County. ARCS has a few different divisions, and I work for the Prevention Division, which is the Violence-Free Coalition, or VFC. The CDC is one that you might all know, but the Center for Disease Control is where we get a bunch of our information. The CDC sends funding to ODH, or the Ohio Department of Health, and that is where a large portion of the money to fund this prevention work comes from. On the CDC's website, there are a lot of different definitions of what kind of violence is out there. First, we'll start with IPV, which is intimate partner violence that I've mentioned before. Next is TDV, which is more specifically teen dating violence. SV and SA, sexual violence and sexual assault, are something we'll also refer to as moving along. I'll use these terms interchangeably with their acronyms and all of their words. Here in part 1, we're going to dive right into what all of the definitions are of the types of violence that I'm talking about. We'll explore what the CDC defines as intimate partner violence and sexual violence, as well as hear from some teens and what they've experienced. I hope by providing this baseline of definitions that it will be easier and benefit you. A branch of the CDC is the Injury Prevention and Control. So the Division of Violence Prevention is where we get most of our definitions for sexual violence, sexual assault, and all of the other things I just mentioned. This division has produced an ample amount of information to educate everyone on what kind of violence is going on within homes, schools, and community environments. Now let's take a closer look at what the CDC defines sexual violence as through this video.
When it comes to sexual violence, it's important to know the facts. But there are just a few other things you should know. Sexual violence includes rape and any other unwanted sexual contact or experience. About 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have experienced sexual violence in the form of physical contact at some point in their lives. Violence starts early. Before the age of 18, 8.5 million women first experienced rape. Victims of sexual violence can experience depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Sexual violence impacts everyone. Its effects ripple through families, neighborhoods, and workplaces. but we all play a role in its prevention. Public health, businesses, schools, communities, and you can work together to stop sexual violence from happening in the first place. It's about addressing and understanding the root cause of why people single others out for cruel or unjust treatment. It's about promoting attitudes and behaviors for equality and respect. It's about implementing bystander intervention training, meaning teaching people when to stand up and speak out, creating safe spaces, and encouraging healthy relationships for everyone.
I hope that video provided some good background on what sexual violence means. Moving forward, we'll keep talking about how the national scope of sexual violence looks, especially for teens, and then we'll move in a little bit closer to what Warren County looks like as it relates to teen dating violence. Next, we're going to watch a video by Break the Cycle. You can find out more at breakthecycle.org. They're now a national organization that supports young people in helping to build healthy relationships in their lives and create a culture without abuse in their communities. This video has different teens and teens into their college years. The youngest is in middle school, the oldest is in college, and everyone in between is sharing a part of their own personal story. This will help us to bring all of these facts into personal stories and be able to relate to it in a more intimate way. Let's watch together.
I'm in high school, college,
High school.
High school.
college, high school.
I'm in middle school.
Abuse comes in many different forms.
It can be more subtle or it can be in your face.
If someone has control over someone else.
I think that there's some misconceptions about abuse among teens and college students. I think the first thing people think of is physical abuse, and so we ignore the emotional and verbal aspects of it and the digital aspects such as texting, and just think of that as normal behavior.
Texting, it can become an invasion of your privacy, and it can be used as a form of control.
Where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing?
Texting can also become abusive when, let's say, one partner is sending, nude pictures. It becomes a breach of their trust and boundaries.
At least in my school, young people do not know what abuse is.
The truth is, I don't think everybody can recognize the signs while they're in an unhealthy or abusive relationship.
Maybe this is just normal for everybody else. If my boyfriend or girlfriend is putting me down, is constantly texting me.
They've probably been working on making you feel bad about yourself for a while, or afraid, or they've threatened you.
It's hard to talk about it.
It's not something that you talk about in school or anywhere.
It can be really difficult to tell a friend or parent what's going on because they may just tell you to leave and maybe you're not ready to leave.
People who are in abusive relationships believe that what they want to do is be in that relationship. They want to be with that person, and then it's all going to magically work out in the end. But, the reality is that it won't. And I think that most people don't realize that the consequences of, serious abuse is that either your life is ruined, you get pregnant, you die.
I have a friend who's experienced abuse.
Yeah, I've experienced dating abuse when I was in high school, and I know friends who have as well.
I had a friend, and she was very mentally abusive to every boy she would go out with.
I was actually in an abusive relationship.
My girlfriend constantly was talking to my friends and telling them, hey, don't talk to him, he's mine.
I told her she was being abusive, and she didn't believe me.
I fell for the star football player, and at first I thought it was so sweet that he wanted to walk me into my next class, but from there it just escalated. It wasn't him being kind to me, it was him controlling me and making sure he knew my every move. I thought that it was normal and that what I was feeling, this sadness and this isolation, was something to be expected. He would tell me all the time what a terrible person my father was.
And it got to the point where I stopped hanging out with my friends and I stopped hanging out with my family, and I didn't really have anyone, and I felt like I was kind of losing myself.
It was difficult, and I needed the help of my family a little bit. I didn't know how to get help or how to get out of it. It was up to my father to end it. I would like to tell the young people who are in an abusive relationship that, you aren't alone. You can get help.
Ask them if they know they're in an abusive relationship, and if they deny it, give them the red flags and the warning signs.
Help them get to the point where they'll have the confidence to leave the relationship, because ultimately they're the ones who are going to have to leave.
I'm here to listen to what's going on. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to provide resources for you, look things up on the internet.
I would tell them to go to loveisrespect.org.
Organizations where you feel like you have people to fall back on and have your back, even if it's really, really hard.
Because sometimes love is blind and you just don't see what other people see. That is hurting you more than bring your happiness.
Listen to yourself, know yourself, become aware of your boundaries, and don't be afraid to speak up about them, and don't ever compromise them.
You deserve healthy and loving relationships.
For all those parents out there, I would say break the ice. We look up to you more than you know, and even when we don't show it, it means so much to us when you give us your advice.
And I think it's really important to be an active bystander. We need to be there to support each other and let our peers know, even if we think they already know they're worth it, or that their parents tell them that, or they hear it from someone, just say it anyways.
Kids need to start talking.
Start talking.
Start talking.
Start talking.
Start talking.
It's time to start talking.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope it helped you put into perspective how important your relationship as an adult in a teenager's life can be, especially when it comes to teen dating violence and protecting themselves from unhealthy relationships. Now that we've learned about what sexual violence is and heard from specific teenagers about how they experience that, let's look at the definition of what exactly teen dating violence is. Again, all these definitions come straight from the CDC. TDV is under the overarching IPV, intimate partner violence, and it occurs between two people in a close relationship. This is no matter what their sexual orientation is, what their age is. If it's between two people who are considered intimate partners with each other, this is when teen dating violence applies. TDV, or even more specifically domestic violence, might be seen as just physical violence, but there are 4 types of behavior that apply to TDV. These are physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, and stalking. I'm sure we're mostly all aware of what physical violence is, with hitting, kicking, or any type of physical force. And then sexual violence we just learned about. But I just want to highlight that this does involve certain technologies. So any type of sexting is included within sexual violence in teen dating violence. We might not think of our teens as using psychological aggression, but they in fact are. And this is the use of verbal or nonverbal communication with the intent to harm a person, either mentally or emotionally, or exert some sort of control or power over their partner. And stalking we most likely have all heard of. And this also can relate to some sort of technological stalking with phones, texting, social media, all of that kind of thing. But it's any sort of repeated pattern of unwanted attention, and it causes fear or concern for somebody's safety, maybe a loved one or a friend, or their own safety. Teens are just starting to learn what is normal in an intimate relationship, and we should be able to give them some of these definitions to let them know what is normal and what is not normal. When teasing, name-calling, or play fighting goes too long or becomes uncomfortable, that is not a normal part of a relationship, and we need to be able to be truthful with our teens. Teens also might be especially afraid to share with their parents or their caregivers about some sort of violence that they're experiencing or an unhealthy behavior with their intimate partner. But we should not be afraid to reach out to them and talk to them about this before it even happens. So let's move into the national scope of how big this problem is. It's actually more common than we might think. The CDC collects data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, or the YRBS. I'll be referring to the YRBS a lot going on from here. This is an anonymous survey where they fill out who they are and pick their gender, their identity, but no names are given in this survey, to create some sort of anonymity for teens to express exactly what they've experienced so we get a clearer picture. This data was published in January 2020, indicating that this information is from the year 2019. So what are the exact statistics? When we look at teens reporting experiencing physical dating violence in the last year, nearly 1 in 11 females and 1 in 15 males have experienced this type of violence. We move to the next set and see that out of high school students who reported experiencing sexual dating violence, about 1 in 9 females and 1 in 36 males have experienced this. Now, when we look at this retrospectively, we can see that 26% of women and 15% of men experience intimate partner violence before the age of 18 for the first time. Although we might think so, teen dating violence is not shared equally across all groups. Sexual minorities and some racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by many types of violence, including sexual violence and intimate partner violence. Now we're going to zoom the lens in and see how TBV and intimate partner violence is affecting teens in Warren County. As I mentioned earlier in this webinar, I am able to teach a curriculum in Warren County high schools about teen dating violence and just helping them understand what healthy relationships should be looking like. After each week with high school students, we send them a post-test. These are the results from the last 5 years of post-tests from the collective county. As you can see, the highest statistic is knowing a friend or classmate who's been in an unhealthy relationship. So this is someone else that they know who's been in an unhealthy relationship. The next highest, which was different, is they know of someone who's been pressured to do things sexually they weren't ready to do. After that, we see typically they identify as having been in their own unhealthy relationship at around 40% or a little bit higher. Thankfully, the lower statistics are knowing someone or being themselves in an abusive relationship. You can see themselves being in an abusive relationship as the lowest statistic, usually under 20%. And then the next one is knowing a friend or a classmate who's been in an abusive relationship, all underneath 40% within the 5 years. So within this aggregated data, you can see that this kind of relationship violence is happening within our own schools in Warren County. Although we wish these statistics were different, we are thankful for this information and this knowledge so that we know how to educate our students and perform prevention work coming up in the future and into 2021. In part 2 of this webinar, we are going to explore and explain the risk factors present for our teens when it comes to intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, and sexual violence. These are all risk factors published by the CDC, and we'll take a look at risk factors in a lot of different realms, so let's go forward. The CDC has published a social ecological model framework for prevention. And this framework involves 4 separate sort of realms that are a part of either risk factors or protective factors. First, we'll look at the individual level. Next, we'll look at relationships between 2 people or a couple people. Next, we'll look at the community and relationships they have with their communities. And then at the larger circle, you'll see is the societal level. We are going to zoom the lens in pretty close and look at the individual level of risk factors that teens and kids experience. Anytime they're experiencing some sort of deficiency, maybe in self-esteem, there's low income within the household, or there's low academic achievement, this can put them at risk for violence and other sorts of adversities. Something we wish wasn't on the list, but it is their age. So they are more likely to experience some sort of violence, especially sexual violence, under the age of 18. Anytime kids have their own sort of substance abuse issues going on, or they're seeing it in their household, there's more likely of a chance that they are at risk for intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or abuse. If they're experiencing any sort of mental health issues, or just in general they're having trouble with interacting with others, there's a lack of empathy there, that can be a risk factor for them. Along with this, if they're feeling any sort of isolation from family or friends, or they have few friends, they're at risk as well. If they have a prior history of abuse within the household or with their friends, that puts them at higher risk to kind of perpetuate that violence in their lives. And then the very last couple, our belief in strict gender roles, either from school or from their parents or from friends, anytime they're trying to be boxed into something that they might not necessarily fit into, or there's attitudes around them that accept or justify violence, this puts them at risk for experiencing violence themselves. Next in the social ecological model is their relationships with others, with their family, just kind of that close-knit people that they see probably day in and day out. If any teens are experiencing a family environment that's generally physically violent or involves conflict, parents or guardians displaying an inadequate way of resolving conflict, or they're unsupportive of each other, this puts their children, their teens at risk of experiencing violence or sexual violence. And again, that history of abuse, anytime a child experiences abuse, there is a likelihood that they may perpetuate that violence in other relationships within their life. And then if they don't feel necessarily supported by their parents, or there's a lack of parenthood within their close relationships, that puts them at risk for displaying signs of violence. If their close group of friends or peers at school generally associate with being sexually aggressive, hypermasculine, or even antisocial, this can put them at risk for some form of violence. And again, any time that they've experienced violence and they've perpetuated that into some sort of relationship, and they've already had an intimate partner that has been abusive, it's likely to happen again. If they're displaying any signs of jealousy, possessiveness, or negative emotion in their relationships, that's definitely something to look out for, to make sure that it doesn't kind of go into this SV or other forms of violence. And lastly, it's so good for teens, kids, really anyone of any age, to feel social support so that they don't feel isolation. So anytime there's a lack of that, that puts them at risk as well. Now I want us to look at how sexual minorities are affected by teen dating violence disproportionately. Just so we're all in the same field, I want to explain what LGBTQIA+ stands for. The initials are actually longer than this, so let me give you exactly what they stand for. The L is lesbian, then we go gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally, and pansexual. So those who identify in any of these categories are disproportionately affected. Let's see how the youth are affected by sexual violence. This data was specifically pulled from the YRBS. All of these statistics are LGBTQIA+ specific. So 23% of students who have dated or went out with someone during the last 12 months before the survey experienced some sort of sexual dating violence in the past year. 18% of them experienced physical dating violence, and 18% were forced to have sexual intercourse at some point in their lives. Again, this is not out of all teenagers who took the survey. This is specifically about the youth who identify as LGBTQIA+ and what they've experienced. So you can see rates are higher just for this small group of people. Next, I want us to take a look at a news clip. This news clip refers to domestic violence. However, we can see how that can correlate with LGBTQIA+ youth.
Well, we're continuing this week's conversation on domestic violence. Studies show one group experiences it more than others. That's the LGBTQ community.
I found the numbers to prove it, but also realized the reasons why and how it happens to this community are not researched as much as they are for other groups. When we see a purple ribbon on someone's chest or in a storefront, we know what it means. It's the universal sign of support for domestic violence victims. There's a lot of support out there for people who struggle with the unthinkable behind closed doors. But there are also people who suffer through this significantly more than others. No, not necessarily women, but the LGBTQ community. A branch of the CDC called the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control collected data on this issue. It created the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which does something many other domestic violence statistics don't. Highlights homosexual, bisexual, and transgender people in its numbers. It found about 44% of lesbian women and about 61% of bisexual women have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by a partner. Compare that to only 35% of heterosexual women. The men's disparities aren't as drastic but still exist. 26% of gay men and about 37% of bisexual men have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by a partner. Compare that to 29% of heterosexual men. The survey also found transgender domestic abuse victims are more likely to experience violence in public. Breaking it down by types of violence, 20% of LGBTQ victims experience physical abuse, 15% have been verbally harassed, 11% reported violence involving a weapon, and 4% experienced sexual violence. Very few scholars have taken the time to dig into why this happens. Medical scientists at Northwestern University refer to something called the minority stress model. It says being part of a minority group contributes to high stress. The scholars at Northwestern say same-sex couples are dealing with the stress of being a sexual minority. One partner is physically taking their added stress out on another. Experts also use the double closet phenomenon as a contributing factor when discussing the topic with the BBC. They explained how some victims in same-sex relationships are reluctant to report abuse because they don't want to be outed by officials. As these trends become more widely known, assistance for victims is slowly but surely becoming more available. In the past few years, the Federal Violence Against Women Act expanded to assist everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. The CDC says it's focused on preventing all intimate partner violence represented in its research, because the key to creating respectful, nonviolent domestic relationships actually starts outside of the home with friends, family, and communities, respecting just how serious this issue can be. Now, when it comes to seeking help with domestic violence in the LGBTQ community, it can be tricky.
That's why I chatted with Dr. Adam Messenger. He's the author of LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Lessons for Policy, Practice, and Research. And he says the rates of domestic violence among same-sex couples are indeed higher. And he explains why.
Are the rates different among same-sex couples against opposite-sex couples?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Cody. There is surprisingly a difference. So people who have experienced same-gender relationships are actually more likely to experience domestic violence than people who only experience different gender relationships. And that's also been found to be the case for those who identify as sexual minorities, such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer, relative to heterosexuals. It's been true across the board for all forms of domestic violence. Psychological, physical, and sexual abuse rates are higher among sexual minorities.
Do we have any idea why?
That's a great question. It's a hard question to unpack because there are so many different factors that go into understanding domestic violence. Research has shown there's actually a lot of similarities in the risk factors for domestic violence among sexual minorities and heterosexuals, such as experiencing child abuse or witnessing abuse between your parents. Scholars believe that there's a link between those youth family violence experiences and adulthood domestic violence because you're exposed to abuse that makes you socialized into accepting abuse as a normal, healthy response to conflict. But if we're really going to try to understand why sexual minorities are at an elevated risk, we need to move beyond those common risk factors to helping us look at risk factors unique to sexual minorities.
Can we touch on some of those and just start listing those off of what is different within that unit than an opposite sex couple?
Absolutely. So on the perpetration side of the spectrum, Some research suggests that experiencing homophobia and biphobia can result in extreme levels of stress. Now, minority stress, any form of stress, can be responded to in healthy ways, such as going to the gym to exercise, meditating, and so forth. Others will respond to that extreme level of stress using violence and aggression. So experiencing stress does not necessarily mean you will perpetrate domestic violence, but it is an increased risk factor. But on the victimization side of the spectrum, some research suggests that abusers will specifically target sexual minority victims that they believe are less likely to leave them, less likely to ask for help. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. So for instance, research suggests that sexual minority survivors have a difficult time recognizing they're being abused because they grow up in a society that's taught them that real domestic violence only occurs between a heterosexual man and a woman. In addition, sexual minorities oftentimes have additional barriers to seeking help. They might not have available resources in their local area that accept sexual minorities. They might not have resources in their area that have services that are designed specifically for sexual minorities. They might fear and experience discrimination by service providers. And all of those make it much more difficult for sexual minority survivors to reach out for help. Abusers who know that might feel more emboldened and empowered to initiate and engage in abuse.
After that interview with Adam, it made me, think about my upbringing in rural America and how access to resources in a town of 2,000 people for the LGBTQ community
doesn't happen.
It doesn't exist.
No.
So it's even trickier to find that help.
And I think it's also important to point out that this is a social, this is not a group of people that you can measure in some way or that have necessarily something in common that's biological. So this is clearly a social issue. Do you know what I'm saying? This
Totally.
is something that's as a result of something that's happening to these people. And that's why there has to be theories and not things that you can prove. Because, what other explanation is there? We have to kind of dive into why is it happening this way to this group of people?
And I think your package did a great job at talking about that minority stress and the double closeted. They are tricky waters to navigate, but there are resources out there if you need them.
Yeah, they're real. They're real things happening. Well, if you find yourself in need of help, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7. Just call 1-800-799-7233. You can also reach out to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs at 212-714-1141.
I hope you were able to get a specific look at how this sexual minority experiences intimate partner violence. The narrative is slightly different for this group. However, we want them to receive the same kind of care and the same kind of help as everyone else. Now you'll see in community and societal levels that the list is a little bit smaller. However, they are just as important as the individual and relational level. If any child is experiencing poverty, which we know is quite a large statistic of kids, they are at risk of SV or SA. Anytime there's a tolerance or a general tolerance of SV within a community, that puts all the teenagers at risk. Or anytime there's weak community policy around SV, that can put them at risk and really doesn't help that if something were to happen, there is weak policy around this topic. And lastly, you'll see anytime a child lives within a community or neighborhood that there's low social capital or just low support or cohesion, that can put them at risk for violence. Now, when we move out to the societal level, this is more of the collective impact that our society has on teens, and they are definitely seeing this through the actions of their parents, guardians, school teachers, and especially on any form of social media. Just like we mentioned before, you'll see at the very bottom, if there's weak laws or policies related to SV or gender equity, that puts them at a risk for experiencing SV. And we'll see with the top two kind of bullet points here that anytime there is this idea that certain genders should act certain ways, there's cultural norms that support aggression for males, male superiority or sexual entitlement for males, that's a risk factor. And then maintaining women's inferiority or sexual submissiveness, or asking women to appear cold or something like that, where the gender roles are really amplified and we're putting on or projecting these gender identity roles to our teens. That is a risk factor for them to be possibly experiencing or SV or perpetrating SV. A lot of the things that were just listed in the social ecological model from the CDC are considered adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. The CDC states that ACEs have a tremendous impact on future violence, victimization, and perpetration, and lifelong health and opportunity issues. Now, as children don't normally have the choice of what childhood experiences they have, it's up to us to make sure that our community and our homes and our families are providing the right opportunities for children and not giving them these adverse childhood experiences. To further explain the impact that ACEs can have and how that works on a deeper level neurologically, let's take a look at a video that explains it a bit more.
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the developing brain. Genes, nature, are like the blueprint. They provide the basic framework for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well. Stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty, are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on will help prevent many of these negative outcomes. One of the key ingredients for healthy development is having warm, loving, and actively engaged caregivers. This involves promoting serve and return interactions, where caregivers actively and warmly engage with the child, making eye contact, responding to sounds, words, gestures, emotional needs, and sharing experiences like reading and play. Providing programs that support caregivers to strengthen these abilities are the blocks that build healthy foundations for life.
As we've just learned, there are so many complexities to ACEs and how they impact our kids. And we can see how experiences mentioned before in such as the individual level or the community level, relationship level, that if kids or teens experience any of these that are risk factors, that can be something that can turn into an ACE and affect their neurological wiring. So we have a hugely important role to play when it comes to preventing these ACEs from happening, and if they do, teaching our children how to work through it most appropriately. Through this, we can provide the prevention work that is necessary to continue to help prevent intimate partner violence within their futures. In part 3, or the final part of this webinar, we are going to look at exactly what we can do now that we know all of the risk factors that our kids are facing. Sometimes talking about risk factors can be disheartening because we know our teens are experiencing this, whether it's in our control or completely out of our control. However, know that you're not alone and that there are hundreds of other adults out there looking to prevent teen dating violence in the kids within their own lives. Part 2 of this webinar series is designed specifically to explore the protective factors to help prevent this type of violence. I hope you tune into that webinar because we will give an in-depth look at what you can do specifically for the teens in your life and how prevention is working. For the next 10 minutes, I want us to take a look at a TED Talk. It's a TEDx event that was independently organized in Carson City. Brianna is recounting her story of dealing with teen dating violence and intimate partner violence into her adult years. Toward the middle and end of her talk, she gives some really great pointers about how we can prevent teen dating violence from the inside out. Let's tune in and listen.
I'm going to start by taking our minds to another realm for a moment. Now, this isn't a distant place filled with sunshine and daisies. In fact, it's a very tumultuous place. We are entering the mind of a teenager, and it's going to get real, real fast. You are sitting in the front seat of your blue 1996 Isuzu Rodeo. You have all of your possessions in the back seat. Anything that means anything to you, and that's including clothes and toiletries. You're in this position because you witnessed severe domestic violence in your home the night before. And despite doing what you could to keep the situation safe, including calling 911, the offender is back in the home, so you chose to leave. You continue going to high school, and you're early to classes even every day, even though you were sleeping on someone's floor the night before. You have absolutely no idea what the consequences would be if you actually shared your whole story, so you keep silent. You graduate that year with both honors and career and technical education diplomas, so everything's going fine, right? Fast forward 3 years, you're in a relationship, and you saw domestic violence, so even though this relationship isn't all that great all the time, that doesn't mean it's unhealthy, right? I mean, he punches holes in the walls. He backs you into a corner until you admit that he's right. He controls where you go, what you wear, who you talk to. But he loves you unconditionally, so that's love, isn't it? You have a friend who keeps asking you why you're still dating this guy. Every time she gets to talk to you, you're always talking about a new fight that you've had. You see, every why question is going to lead to a defensive answer. It happens naturally, like this. She asks, "Why did he do that today?" You say, "Well, he was tired." She asks, "Why did he do that last week?" You say, "Well, it was just one of those moods, just one of those days." She asks, "Why did he treat you like that?" You say, "It was my fault." Now I'm going to bring it back to reality here because I have something really important to tell you. This is my story. And it wasn't until a friend asked me, "If you started dating this guy today, would you still want to enter a relationship with him?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And it was in that moment I realized I needed to leave that relationship. You see, it wasn't until I answered that question that I realized domestic violence, or teen dating violence, which is what we're talking about today, looks different from the inside out. Like I said, I saw domestic violence. That was obvious. But when I was in the position of defending someone who was verbally abusing me, I lacked the resources and knowledge necessary to know what was really going on. So I'm here today because I'm taking my experience and I'm turning it into a reason to pursue prevention of teen dating violence. Domestic violence is a cycle that can continue beyond the four walls of the home it occurs in. It affects the lives and relationships of everyone in the home, but particularly the youth who are trying to figure out what they deserve in relationships. And so by focusing on the youth in our community, through encouraging positive affirmations, mentoring relationships, and early intervention, we can break the cycle of teen dating violence. So starting with positive affirmations, I will tell anyone that yoga saved my life. It taught me how to control my breathing, which taught me how to control the panic attacks I was having. It taught me to be mindful, to be aware of my mind and my body, and to tell myself that I am worth it. Positive affirmations are statements we repeat to ourselves over and over until we truly believe them. Encouraging positive affirmations in youth helps them to know their worth because it is coming from the inside out. If you can think back to being inside the mind of that teenager, and then to a place where you know you deserve respect and healthy relationships, can you imagine how empowering that is to now be here? And so although positive affirmations are fantastic for everyone, let's start that habit young. Now, for mentoring relationships. I know the mind of a teen can be an intimidating place. But if we care about these teens and we want them to have healthy relationships, we can't be afraid of having those tough, awkward conversations, because the truth is their lives are kind of tough and awkward right now. So be available for a teen that you know. This goes for boys too, because it's not just girls who are in need of positive role models. It takes two people to be in a relationship, and both sides are deserving of this attention and information. The common discourse surrounding domestic violence relies on the model that the girl is the victim or survivor. And although that primarily is what is reported, we have to be thinking about underreporting and also the stigma associated with any person of any gender identity who is wanting to share their story. These teens are seeking validation that they are doing something right along this journey, and you can be the one to sit down with them, tell them that you care, and hear that story. Build trust in that relationship not by giving advice, but by being there, opening up that space, and validating their worth. For my topic of early intervention, I'm feeling the need to step up onto a soapbox, although I'm feeling this little red dot is a soapbox in and of itself, and say that we need evidence-based curricula to supplement the sexual education our youth are receiving in middle and high schools. This topic falls under the umbrella of teen dating violence and is also something that I experienced. I realized this watch could potentially be watched from all over the world. And if you're in a place where this is currently happening in your community, great. Keep going. But listen to my reasons as to why it is so important. Our sexual education classes need to be coupled with information about respect and consent. We can talk about the act and the diseases and the consequences and any of those topics that are bound to increase the awkwardness in any room. But are we talking about how to say no? Are we talking about how it's okay to say no? That even if you're being threatened, you can say no? That it's never your fault? That even if it's someone you're dating, you can say no? That if this happens to you, you can access resources and get help? Because we need to be talking about these things. If we are going to encourage positive affirmations in our youth, they need to know their worth in every single situation they come across. We can all do more to support the advocacy efforts of organizations who provide potentially life-saving services. I'm asking you to have awkward conversations with teens where you might want to have some tools in your toolbox going in so that you know how to respond appropriately. One national organization with incredibly useful resources is called Break the Cycle. You can write it down, it's breakthecycle.org. I have recently seized some opportunities to assist them in planning their Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, which happens every February. My contributions this year are going to be talking about positive affirmations. I find myself printing out every handout that they have. And now that you know about this resource, you too can utilize those tools and contribute to their efforts if you can, because that is how we raise awareness. I want to thank you all for making the prevention part of my heart beat a little bit stronger today. You now have the ability to leave here, talk about what you heard today, and do something about it, because you have the ability to empower youth in your community and to make a difference in their lives. So master positive affirmations yourself, and then share what worked for you. Take a teen out to lunch and give them that space to have an awkward conversation. Support adding evidence-based curricula to your middle and high schools, and also the advocacy efforts of local, state, and national organizations that surround you. Break the cycle of teen dating violence. Thank you.
I really enjoy in this video that Brianna gives a call to action at the very end. Sometimes it is awkward to start conversations with our teens about topics like teen dating violence, but they are so important if we want to prevent this from happening. I also want to challenge you to take what you've learned today and put it into application within your own life. And as we finish up, I will be happy to give you some resources so that you can take the knowledge that you've learned and expand upon it. If you're wanting to explore our resources further, visit the cdc.gov and click on violence prevention. From there, you can see a lot more details that I did not mention, but they do have a vast collection of data on this type of violence and different types of violence that our teens are experiencing, or that you or someone else you know might be experiencing in your life. As I mentioned before, the Violence Free Coalition collects data from Warren County high schools, and if you're curious about any of that, feel free to email me at hsmith@vfcwc.org, or you can email me with general questions or comments that you have from this video.